There is definitely a change in the legal industry. The way that your business is today is more complex. There's more government regulations, more technology, more globalization. What were they doing when they were at the head of their business? Were they actually knowing what was going on with their competitors? Were they just sitting on their laurels? 70% of them rate their primary firms with a B. That's kind of like 2/3 of my friends would never recommend me.
Good morning. I want to thank you all for coming as well. I really appreciate it. We know how valuable your time is. And as I always like to do at this time, I just want to thank you all for your time and your patience in talking with myself, my reporters, and my editors throughout the year. It's very valuable to us. As I always say, we always want to produce content, work on stories, trends, problems and anomalies that you're interested in, that really help you in your everyday work experience. So I really want to take my time and thank you for that. And thank you for all your efforts throughout the year. One brief mention is, you'll see on your tables there's the little blue slips. We have a little questionnaire. If before the end of the program, if you could just fill that out, we'd love to get your feedback. We're looking, I think a lot of you find this program very valuable, and we're looking to maybe put on some more programs in the future to, to meet your needs or to sort of hit any kind of sweet spots in terms of content or information you're looking for. So I have the pleasure this morning of introducing our keynote speaker, Kim Desmarais from Peer Monitor. As Hal mentioned, Kim's done this program for us in a couple other markets. I was there in Pittsburgh and also in New Jersey, and Kim has a lot of good data and a lot of good insightfulness, and I think you'll find it very interesting and very informative. Kim is a consultant with Peer Monitor, and she excels in assisting law firm leaders with determining and interpreting key financial and operation metrics to help monitor their firms. She provides competitive intelligence and insights on key data such as rates, realization, expenses, and practice performance in order to help firms monitor what they're doing and make key strategic decisions. Prior to joining Thomson Reuters, Kim worked for 8 years in the legal field, providing law firms with consulting and educational services. And most recently, she held the position of senior financial analyst for a large law firm. Ladies and gentlemen, Kim Desmarais.
Thank you, Hack. Thank you. All right, I'm gonna get started right away. So I know that you're eating breakfast, but while you're looking at my screen, what do some of the names of these organizations bring to mind as I bring them up here on the screen? What are some of the things you're thinking about when you see them displayed here? Well, you're probably thinking, they definitely were at the top of their game years ago. But today, some of them don't exist. Also, some of them have actually had to change the way that they do business. Some of them have had to change some of the products that they were offering. So you wonder, what were they doing when they were at the head of their business? What were they thinking? Were they actually knowing what was going on with their competitors? Did they even know they had competitors and who those competitors were? Were they just sitting on their laurels? So my role today is to try to help you to understand how the legal industry is going on today, what some of those competitive challenges that you might have. You're probably feeling them, but perhaps there are some that you're not aware of, because it's extremely important to know what's going on outside these windows in order for you to have strategic plans internally within your firms. So I'm going to kind of give you an overview of how the industry is doing, using some key performance indicators that you might be familiar with. In addition to that, since we are here in Pennsylvania, I have broken out some of that data so you can kind of get a feel for how this state specifically is doing compared to some of the others within the US. In addition to that, I mentioned this competitors. Are you really seeing what's going on in your industry and how your competitors are sort of perhaps not stealing your business, but competing with you in terms of business? So we'll talk a little bit about the legal ecosystem, and then drill a little bit specifically more into firm performances. So some of the things that Hank mentioned, I look at realization, look at rates, and expenses, so you can kind of get an overall feel. And so where I'm getting this data from is two sources. The first, obviously, is Peer Monitor. Peer Monitor is a business of Thomson Reuters. It is a competitive intelligence solution that allows firms to look at how you're performing to your peers within your state, within your practices. You can look at that data from a firm overview. You can look at it from a practice view. You can look at it from a location view, specifically Pennsylvania, specifically Philadelphia. And you can even look at the data and compare in terms of individual titles. So how are your second-year associates doing? How are your non-equity partners doing? And you can see we break our participants out by the segments. It is a global product, so we do have data for across many countries. Obviously, firms having offices outside of the borders of North America. The second source is right here in this room. Many of you participated in the Managing Partner Survey that's done once a year. So I'm going to use some of that data also to kind of give you a sort of indication of how we see the big picture and then specifically your firms. And you can see the demographics. 82 firms participated, and it's mostly in the Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, but also Harrisburg area too, so you'll get a view of that data. So let's just dive into it and look at how the industry is doing today. This graph, we call it our demand curve. Demand, because I'm going to use that a couple of times this morning, demand is total hours worked for all timekeepers. So this demand curve really and truly represents the heartbeat of what Peer Monitor sees in the industry. And so you can see, basically, 2011 and on, it's pretty flat from a growth standpoint. We're looking at demand growth. Since the recession, things have been around flat to neutral, not a lot of movement. Granted, there's a little bit of a dip there in 2013, and basically just to let you know, that was one quarter at the end, that last quarter of 12, where firms were adjusting, making changes to meet that so-called fiscal cliff that was going to occur. Other than that, it is pretty flat. Now, is it ever going to go back to the way it was prior to the recession? And basically around that time, if you use compound annual growth rates, it was about a 5 to 6% on a regular basis, year-over-year growth. We've not seen that since that time. And will we ever see that? Don't know, because like I say, it's been pretty flat. The way that your business is today is more complex. There's more government regulations. There's more technology that forces you to think of different ways of doing your business. There's more globalization. And because of some of that, there's additional competition coming in and having seepage into this demand. So some firms have felt, gosh, in order for me to capture some of the demand that's flat, perhaps I need to get bigger. So in the first 6 months of this year, interestingly enough, there were 48 mergers. And then in the 3 months of the summer, 20 more firms merged. Well, in your managing partner survey, a question was asked, did you guys merge within the last, say, 2 years? 81% said no. So 81% means there were a few of you that did. But the next question was, do you have any interest? Is there an opportunity you're trying to seek? Are you looking to perhaps merge? And that number is around 55%. So 55% of you are considering actually looking for some type of merger. And where do you want to do that? You typically want to do it here within the state. The majority of the responses were here within the state or on the East Coast. And I did actually do this presentation in the first part of this year using your data from 2014. And interesting then, you were looking to merge or have opportunities on the West Coast. So this year it's around the East Coast that you're starting to think about. And I will tell you that about 9% of you said you want to go to Asia. So when we think about where the markets are today, the United States is 8 times larger than the next market. And the next market is the UK and then China. So when we think about the difference between how the US, from a legal standpoint, compared to outside of our borders, we're 8 times larger than any other market out there, other than the UK being next in China. So the fact that you're looking to go Asia fits in line with that. So when we think of those mergers, or we think about firms trying to get bigger to try to capture this demand, What are some of the things that you're doing to try to do that? What are some of the things you're thinking about? Because again, we do not know if this demand curve will stay the same or if it will change. One of the things that Peer Monitor does on a quarter basis is we produce what we call the PMI, or Peer Monitor Index. And what that is taking some key drivers of profitability and looking quarter over quarter changes. So this is the third quarter, comparing the third quarter of 13 to the third quarter of 14. And we start at the top with demand. You can see it's 0.2% for the third quarter of 2015, and that's pretty flat looking at all of those other 2 quarters, or 2 different years. Next in line is productivity. Productivity is a result, or an effect, of demand, which is hours, and lawyer growth. There's definitely been an increase in lawyer growth year over year, yet demand is flat. So the effect is productivity is down. Productivity is down year to date. We'll see that in just a moment. But for the quarter, it was negative 1.1. Next is rates. Rates is an area that Peer Monitor has been looking at for quite a bit now, close to about 15 months, because we've seen a shift in rates that we've never seen before. You can see for the third quarter of 2015, it was 2.6% growth. Okay, that's growth. That's a positive, yes. But if you look at the other 2 years, over the last couple of years, it's been at a 3%, 3.2%. So what's going on with worked rates? This is worked rates. You could say, same term, you might use agreed, you might use negotiated. It's the same, worked rates. So that's an area that we're definitely going to look at, and I'm going to mention it more frequently as we move on into the presentation. And last is expenses. You're looking at trying to grow that top line revenue and definitely making efforts to control expenses. A little bit of an increase in direct, and that's definitely speaking to the lawyer growth that I just said. So let's look at the key performance indicators. So for some of you in the back of the room, that gold is October of this year. And then the remainder is year to date into October. You can see that demand here in October, it was not a good month. Prior to this, we've had a negative demand for the last couple of months, but not as bad as October. October was down negative 3.8%. Not sure if you in the room have felt that or not, but that definitely had pushed us to pretty flat for overall demand year to date. Prior to October, we were above the 0 line. It was about a 0.1% positive. Now we're a 0.1% negative. So it still speaks to that flat demand. Let's look at rates. Worked rates, again, I mentioned, is the area that we're looking at. It right now is at a 2.5. 2.5 in October for 2015. That is the lowest growth that we've seen in rates for 56 months. That's February of 2011. So for 56 months, we've had positive growth closer to the 3% than we have seen today. So that October also has brought total rate growth down for year to date. Now, some of the things that we think about is, what are firms doing? Have they decided that growing their rates is not necessarily the #1 strategy? Perhaps it's an overall view of you looking at other drivers of profitability. So this is definitely something that we'll continue to look at. So for having rates at a growth that we've not seen for 56 months, it is definitely an area for something for us to look at. Fees is affected by, obviously, demand, which is hours, and rate. But where I want you to kind of look more is toward the very end, toward the right of this screen, is lawyer growth. For the last couple of years, we've seen it basically 1 to 2% growth. So firms are continuing to hire, and yet when we look at productivity, and productivity is at about a 5.2% negative for October, again, due to that low demand. But year to date, it is negative territory. And the way that I describe productivity is I think about it as a pie. So demand is one pie, and the pie doesn't get any bigger. So the more you add lawyers, the more you add growth, then those slices of that pie get smaller and smaller. So the productivity is definitely an effect of growing lawyers. Now wasn't yesterday because I was on a plane. So Monday I was reading that the U.S. Labor Board came out to say that there were 600 legal positions in the month of November. And in October, there were 1,300 positions. So there's definitely growth happening in the legal services, happening for lawyers. But how does that fit with demand? Next, I'm breaking out the data by MLAW, because there's a few of the firms here who fit into each of these buckets. And so we look at the top 100. This particular graph, key performance indicators, again, the data is as of October. What's interesting for us and what we've noticed is that it is the MLAW 100, so it's the top 50 and the bottom 50, that have actually had the most positive movement in 2015. That was not the case over the last 2 years. It was the second 100. The second 100 had 63 positive firms in 2014. Today, with this data, there's only 49 firms that are in positive territory for the second 100. The other interesting part here is we also seen the mid-size. Mid-size was affected quite a bit by October. They didn't do that well. But overall, for this year, mid-size has definitely come back. They were struggled for over 3 years. So it's interesting to see the shift in where business is going in terms of these segments. And one of the parts that we see here with the MLAW, the top 50, is that's not actually where the growth is in the MLAW 100, it's the bottom 50. And another area here is also with rates. We used to see that the MLAW 100 was trying to grow their rates considerably, adding quite a bit of increase in their standard rates. It's kind of that sort of publicized rates. But then obviously at the end of the day, they were discounting more, and we'll see that in a few minutes. But now what we're seeing here is there's some of the effect of, say, being globalized. So a lot of the MLAW 100 have firms outside of the U.S., and so with the strength of the U.S. dollar is obviously affecting some of the rates that they're seeing too. So it's very interesting for us to have seen a shift this year in the segments. We're pretty excited about the mid-size, to be honest with you. They were struggling for quite a while. So let's talk about that demand. The first thing that you're going to look here is this goldish line. And each one of those dots actually represents a firm. So how firms are in terms of positive growth or negative growth. 2015 compared to 2014. The next one, which is blue, is how they compared 14 to 13. And then my last one here is gray, how they compared 13 to 12. The interesting thing to see is I've told you now that 2015 is kind of flat. Well, it's smack in the middle of those other 2 years in terms of firms, growth, and the positive movement that they've had. There were 54 firms that were positive here overall. This is not divided out by segments. This is specific firms. You can kind of see over there on the right-hand side above the 10% growth, those outliers. What is it that those firms are doing different that allows them to have that substantial growth? So when we look at this positive or negative positioning of firms, there are only 49 firms, or 49% of firms are here in the positive territory. Compared to last year, there are over 56 of them. So this shifting of positive to negative, we think about it, we use the expression flipping. So how many flip from positive to negative or negative to positive? It's flat, it's a 0.7. So for every one that goes positive, one goes negative. Every one that goes positive, one goes negative. If we were to look at these firms and we stick them into buckets, so we look at the growth, demand overall. For 2015, it's a pretty big gap actually. The majority of the firms, and that's around about 30, actually it's 28%, is in the area of negative 5% growth to positive 5% growth. This is 2015. Remember, it was smack in the middle of those two lines, the blue and the gray. And yet in 2014, over 33% were actually in that positive 0 to 5%. So there is that shift in how are firms shifting from that positive growth to negative growth, or how are they shifting from negative to positive growth? Are they adding offices? Are they growing their size? What are some of the strategies that they're putting into place to make some of those outliers, like the positive 10%. Just things to think about when you look at what is the competition doing and how are you doing internally within your firm. So let's look at Philadelphia. Let's kind of look at the state of Pennsylvania. So we kind of break it out into these 5 regions, and so you're considered the Northeast. And when we look at each of the regions, what we can see here, and I kind of call it the new gold rush, but we're actually seeing the West Coast actually having some of that positive growth, and also in the South. I know that recently there was, I think it was in Houston, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but they opened up another patent office in Texas. So everybody's thinking they need to, have an office in Texas to have some presence there. There have been 30 firms that have actually opened up offices in the Texas area. But also a patent office in Denver and another office on the West Coast. So a lot of shifting of some of that energy and environmental business also is happening. But when we look at it, it is mostly the West that actually is growing. And you can see at the very end the growth in lawyers. Well, that growth in lawyers obviously is the anticipation of continued demand growth. If we look at it from Pennsylvania and the Northeast, between the two of them, so for Pennsylvania, we're looking at basically a negative 2% growth compared to the remainder of the states in the Northeast. Not sure if that's what you're feeling internally. Also, considerable lawyer growth. So a lot of that lawyer growth can be talent management, looking for laterals to really drive some practices that you're having. Or perhaps there's individuals internally that you're evaluating, but you need to bring in good laterals to help grow the firm. So it's okay to have continual lawyer growth. It's just be understanding that it does affect the productivity. So not sure if this is how you feel or not, but this is what the data is showing in terms of this particular state compared to other Northeast. So let's talk about that competition. Let's talk about that ecosystem. This is the legal services, and it is sized today at about $437 billion. And how is it split out? So corporate is about $160 billion, and when we say corporate here, that's their spend. Their spend internally and dividing it out by the firms. There's definitely some additional competition out there in terms of how business is being shifted from the corporate, which is basically your in-house counsel, your corporate counsel. They're having pressures, budgetary pressures. They have to do better. They have to obviously control their costs. They're making some changes. The industry has actually gone from a seller's market to a buyer's market, and they determine how things are done. So you're making changes based on what you're hearing from your clients. Taking that sort of grouping of information, how it's split between corporate and law firms, just looking at how the legal departments, those general counsel, how they're splitting up the business. There was research done by Thomson Reuters with data from Peer Monitor and some of the other businesses within Thomson Reuters to see how that's being split out. And almost 50% is outside of law firms. So the competition is also accounting firms and financial banking institutions who are giving your clients advice and taking some of that business. In addition to that, I'm going to go back one more because you cannot see this very well, especially the people in the back. But at the very top, there's a tiny, tiny little slice. And that slice is what is part of what we're seeing legal processing outsourcers. People who do e-discovery. People who are lawyer by the hour. That type of business right now is at about $1 billion. They're expected to grow around a compounded annual growth rate of 30%. That equates to $20 billion. So if we look at this pie and we consider how that's going to be split out, is it going to be coming more from law firms? In addition, I said that there were accounting firms doing a lot of business now that law firms were doing. And was it not last month, November, but in October, AIG They have a consulting arm now that are going to work with corporate counsel to help them price. So it's one thing to be aware that this competition is out there. How do you deal with it? How do you work with some of those other alternative providers? Are things I'm sure you're thinking about today during your strategy meetings. Because it's important to know that they're definitely there. So knowing what some of the in-house counsel concerns are, one of their biggest concerns is they have to reduce their spend. Their budgets are no longer wide open and let's spend whatever we want to spend. Their biggest concerns is to try to get less for more efficient timing and costing less. In addition to that, they want to be able to have efficiencies. So some of them are actually hiring. So perhaps those 600 positions that were open last month in November actually were being hired, those lawyers, by your clients, so that they're growing their legal departments with additional staff to try to reduce some of those costs. But it's really important to know that legal services is important. Legal services from law firms is extremely important. They need your expertise. But some of the things that they're doing is they're disaggregating a matter. And what I mean by that is a matter comes in that they need to have you work on, but they might give part of the work to you, they might give part of the work to the accounting firms, they might give part of the work to those other legal processing outsourcers. So there's this disaggregation of matters or convergence of matters. And that actually was a question on your survey. It said, with all of this disaggregation, with all this convergence of matters, have you lost any business because of it? Because they're starting to shrink the number of firms they go to. Well, 38% of you said yes. But for me, the positive side was 55% of you said, I'm actually getting business because of this. I'm getting more business because they're coming to me because they're relying upon me. So that's a positive thing. But one important thing to know is who your client is. So I asked this question, is everyone aware of the Association of Corporate Counsel? All right? Nobody is. So what I want you to know is they have meetings just like you do on an annual basis. It's an association, so they meet regularly. Their last meeting over the last couple of years, they've decided that we need to have some sort of way to help us being corporate counsel, do better, be more proficient, understand how to control their costs. So they came up with that they call the value challenge proposition. And there are 3 components to that value challenge proposition. The first is they want to reduce their costs by 25%. So this is what your clients are trying to do, and they're talking to their colleagues, like you talk to your colleagues. This is what we need to do. We need to reduce our costs. We need to be very efficient at what we do. We need to work with our firms on fee structures. And then we also need to have more efficiency. So we don't want our matters to last so long. Perhaps we want to settle before we go to court instead of litigating for months and months and years and years. This is their value challenge. This is what they want. They also said that 70% of them rate their primary firms with a B. In addition to that, 2/3 of them said that they would not recommend their primary firms. I looked at that, and I think I might have said it at the last presentation I did, that that's kind of like 2/3 of my friends would never recommend me. And then the last is 75% are open to accepting other firms. And I'm sure you're experiencing some of that with 200-page RFPs. You know, you're dealing with procurement people now within your clients, and so it's a longer process. They're looking for better ways, again, to control costs. So one of the survey questions was, this is not what it actually said, but it's how I interpret the question is, are you really aware of what your clients want? Are you really aware if you're meeting their expectations? So do you survey them? Do you gather feedback from them to kind of know if you have met their expectations or if not? And 73% of the respondents said no, they do not survey their clients. Now that might be because you don't do it formally with a written survey similar to the one you filled out. Maybe you're doing it regularly one-on-one. But those who do survey, they do it once a year. Not sure if this is the amount of time that should be spent, again, trying to get feedback from your clients, but knowing what they want and trying to fit into their expectations and partnering with them is important to understand. So overall, there is definitely a change in the legal industry. We saw the demand curve. Used to be in-house counsel and outside counsel working together. But now the shift is to more of that strategic advice that you provide, more of that strategic business that you provide, and that expertise, because there are other sources that your clients are going to. So let's look a little bit deeper now, though, into the performance of law firms. And that demand curve that I showed you at the very beginning, the one that showed flat, I do want to tell you that that was only law firm data. It wasn't the legal industry. And I just showed you that there's definitely business out there, and that business is growing. Legal services is growing. So from a law firm standpoint, we look at all segments here in terms of revenue. So how are firms growing, sort of that top line? And from an overall revenue standpoint, just October year to date here is gold, and then we work our way through to 2013, comparing that. So it's not been as much growth, and we saw that demand with the 3 years, the gold, the blue, and the gray, again this year, right smack in the middle of those 2 years. So we're looking at about a 0.8, 0.9% growth in revenue. This is October. So obviously October, we have 2 more months of the year, 2 more months of the year. A lot of efforts are in collections. So this obviously is not to say that we're only going to make a 1% growth in revenue. But how do you guys feel about it when you looked at your survey? What do you think that you were going to do for the these last 2 years? And it's a very positive. 74% said you're going to increase. The data shows that it's been increasing for the last couple of years. So that's a positive movement. In addition to that, we look at profits per equity partner. Profits per equity partner for just all segments is at 2.5%. So there has been some shift. Granted, we're increasing our lawyer counts. We're going to see in just a moment where some of that growth is. But there have been reductions in partners. So some of the growth could be that reduction in partner, but it's also firms are making sincere efforts to control their costs, and so profit is being driven. The blue line in the middle will show you the range. So we look at the mid-size. We talked about the mid-size shifting to a positive movement this year, which is really a great thing for small firms. But the gap, or not the gap, but the range between the high profits per partner and the low profits per partner is much more severe or much more larger in the mid-size. But this, again, is a positive view. And from a survey standpoint, 70% of you said that your profits per partner are also increased over the last couple of years. Again, positive numbers. Practice demand. The practices within your firms, how are they doing? Well, from the data, what we're seeing here is that our transactional practices, how Peer views them is tax, mergers and acquisitions, real estate, and corporate. So they're all bundled together, have been 2.5 years the leaders in terms of the practices that are growing. Litigation, on the other hand, which is the very end here, represents 31% of the business, represents 31% of demand. That's what that proportionality bar at the very bottom is. 31% is a pretty big piece of total practices within the legal business. Whereas that transactional is around, so that's 31, it was around 29% in terms of that proportionality. So considering those two practices, we don't show all of the practices here because they're so small in terms of total proportion, 2%, 1%. But until October, the majority of those, except for litigation, labor and employment, all the way. So the middle of this screen, we're in a much more positive. That negative 3.8% total demand for October, really brought year-to-date down. But overall, it has been a positive movement in transactional practices. Bankruptcy, always, in the last 4 years, 3-4 years, has been in the negative territory. I always look at that as a positive thing. It probably is not good for you, those of you who practice bankruptcy, but from an economic standpoint, that's a good thing that there aren't that many organizations bankrupt. But the growth also that we see that's not on this, and I mentioned it with those offices opening in Houston, Denver, and California, is patent prosecution. Definitely laws have changed, business is being done differently, but there's growth in patent prosecution. It's just a small proportion that's why it's not on this graph. So how about this region in terms of your particular practices? They're a bit similar with that transactional, but the proportionality is quite different. 12% is corporate. We did have 12%, and real estate, adding those two together, M&A over here. Didn't have M&A on the last slide because it's lower than 3% overall. So those areas, there's a lot more of that here within this state and also within the total states of the Northeast. Good movement. Corporate is doing really well, even though, again, overall, demand was down in October, but it's been very substantial here. So let's talk about how you guys feel your practices are doing in terms of opportunities going forward into 2016. I just listed the top 5. So the bottom one is mergers and acquisitions, which right now is at a negative 53% demand. But the top one is employment. Intellectual properties being both patent lit and patent prosecution, litigation and corporate. So it kind of fits a little bit into the data that I'm showing you from an overall state and Northeast, but these are the practices you feel are opportunities for growth. I will tell you the number one practice that you felt was not an opportunity for growth was bankruptcy. I'm going to look at what I call balance, or we call balance, which is looking at production, looking at lawyer growth, and looking at demand. So these are the lawyer growth and demand trends on how they're trending over the last 4 years. And basically, it's in a negative decline for demand and a positive increase in lawyer growth. But looking at that in terms of the effect of it, productivity is on the decline. So productivity, again, that kind of pie slices. So it's something to really look at when you're considering some of the strategic moves that you're making. So with productivity, though, overall, lawyer hours prior to the recession was about 135 hours per month. Now it's roughly at about 125 hours, 128 hours per month. So it's not gone back to where that recession was. And I think that, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I just read an article, I think that it was from ALM, that the standard for associate hours going forward, you know how it used to be 1,800, somewhere it was like, oh, it's going to be 2,500 hours now. I'm not sure how you can get 2,500 hours out of an entire year, but that's kind of where they're thinking associates need to go. So where are they today? Associates today are almost where it was during the pre-recession, which is around that sort of high 30s, 130 area. But non-equity partners are the ones that are not producing the most hours when we think of these 3 positions. So we have associates at the top that are, again, almost close to the recession, that 135. And then the equity partners in the red in the middle, they're around 123, something like that, year to date. So that pie, again, how are we slicing it? Well, we're slicing it with associates, which actually are, in terms of profitability, they're the lower cost titles. And so this is actually a good trend to see. Bringing in a few more titles, we have the what we call staff attorneys, which are the gray. And then in addition to that is off counsel, which are partners who are slowly on the retirement track. And so if we look at it overall, again, total hours, 125, 128, growth is continuing on the lawyer side. This is replenishment, and I'll explain that replenishment is for every person you hire, every person that leaves, do you replace them? So every person that gets hired, was there someone who left? For every person that left, is there someone that you hire? So we've seen 1 to 2% constant increase over the last 2 to 3 years with lawyer growth. So here it's kind of a 1.2%, 1.2, not percent, but 1.2 persons or replacement. But from a title standpoint, I'm going to slowly highlight some of these because you can kind of see that gray at the top, especially in 2011. That's that staff attorney. So staff attorneys, that position was actually had quite a bit of an increase. So for each one that left, there actually weren't any that really left. There was hardly that position prior to the recession. So that's why we see quite a bit of an increase starting after the recession, because there weren't many of them. But then we can see that that position, we saw the hours, they were pretty much at 110 hours, did not fulfill perhaps your expectations. So for every one of them leaving, we're not seeing as many being replaced. Associates obviously are the ones that are close to more of a 1.4, 1.3 replenishment. Partners. I mentioned when we looked at profits per partner, I said there's been a little bit of a reduction in the number of equity partners. People are looking at their tiering, they're looking at their partner track programs. So we don't see as much replenishment there. It's actually pretty flat. For each one that leaves, perhaps there's a hire or not a hire at all. So just something to think about when we talk about that productivity result or utilization, if you use that word instead of productivity, the effect of hiring. So for your survey, 67% said that they will be hiring less than 10% in 2016. So more of you are thinking of hiring less than you were hiring before. Some of you are thinking of not even hiring any first-year associates. Many of you are saying that sometimes that's an effect of your clients not willing to pay for first-year associates. And then the last one is 23% pretty much said you're not going to be hiring at all in 2016, kind of flat. Let's be stable with what we have now. And that's in your survey. So getting from hours to replenishment, and then last year realization being the discount. So you start off with your worked rates, you start off with, after that you bill, and then what do you collect from it? So from a billing standpoint, we're pretty much at an 85%. And then from a collection standpoint, it goes down to 83%. So I told you that there's continued discounting after the work or the negotiated or the agreed rate is worked with your client. This gap between billing and collected is growing, and that gap means that even though you've worked it out with your client, then you start to bill them. When the collection occurs, there's a continual discount, so that gap is getting wider and wider. Rates, again, is the area that we are seeing a lot of movement. Told you that growth hasn't occurred for quite a while. It's actually on the decline, even though we're in positive territory. But we're looking here at 83%. So what 83% means is 83 cents on the dollar that was actually started to work and eventually was collected. So only 83 cents came in the door. And how does that look from a segment standpoint? It was the MLaw 100 who has pushed rates considerably over the last few years. Not this year, obviously. We saw that in some of the other data. But because of that constant pushing their rate, their clients are still pressuring them to work better at those fees, and therefore they've had to discount more. So they're walking in around 81.5% or 81 cents on the dollar. Just again, this something to consider. This particular realization is where there's kind of like the demand, not sure it's ever going to go back to where it was prior to the recession, those high 90s. That pressure from your clients is continuing to drive up negotiating when it comes to the work. One last thing, you're trying to drive top line, but you're also really working hard at controlling expenses in order to gain those margins and that profit. So there's great efforts with that. Little bit of an uptick, and you can see the blue line, which represents direct expense. Direct expense obviously being lawyer compensation and lawyer expenses, and with that lawyer growth, obviously, you're paying higher for some of those laterals that are coming in. So there's a bit of increase with that. And overall, what are some of those expenses? So we kind of look at things like recruiting, which is a small amount in terms of expenses, but overall year to date, comparing to the prior year, is at a 12% increase from the prior year or the prior time period. And that's that constant need of talent management and hiring. Next, we also see technology. A lot of efforts being made with technology. Everybody's mobile. You're getting equipment to allow you to do work remotely, and cybersecurity. So a lot of infrastructure costs in order to prevent those working with networks. So you constantly are going to see this technology grow in terms of those expenses. Compensation is always going to be the highest. But you've started to hire positions that drive revenue to the bottom line, and those are pricing specialists, project managers. They cost a little bit more, but they do have an overall effect from a positive standpoint on the bottom line. Occupancy, firms are looking now, their leases are coming up, you're starting to downsize. You're thinking of reducing sort of the square footage. You don't necessarily need a room like this. That's your library. So a lot of efforts to try to reduce those costs. And then the last is marketing and business development. Definitely improvements, not improvements, but increases in that, because you're trying to drive value to your clients. It's brand awareness. It's what are some of the things that you're doing in order for your clients to see the true value that you're providing for them. So a lot of costs associated with business development and marketing. So overall expenses for the last 2 years from your survey, this group here, basically 36% of you said you've increased. Well, I already talked about some of those areas where some of that increases. So that makes a little bit of sense for sure. And marketing, because that is business development, that is trying to drive more business to your firm, knowing that there's competition out there. So what is the percent of your budget for marketing and business development compared to your other expenses? And for the survey, it's basically 2.9% of your overall total expenses is spent on business development. Peer Monitor's slice of that, with our firms across the U.S., 6% is spent on marketing and business development. So I ask you this question. I don't know if some of you are really big moviegoers, if you have grandchildren or children that you like to watch movies at home, but I'm kind of a big animated fan of those types of movies. And one of my favorites, actually, is Finding Nemo. I scuba dive. I think Don's in here, and he's a big scuba diver, too. It's quite a very colorful film, and you see a lot going on in the ocean. But there is a scene that Nemo actually is out of the ocean. He's flopping on the dock somewhere, and there are quite a few boats around that dock because it's like a marina. And so the camera kind of pans back, and you see all of these masks from the big ships, and covered over all of them, it's full of seagulls. And those seagulls are actually staring down at poor Nemo flopping, single little fish, on the dock. And all of a sudden, they all say, mine, 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 mine. And what that basically is they're staring at one opportunity, one fish, instead of looking out to the big blue ocean out there with hundreds of opportunities, hundreds of fish. So I'll ask the same question of you. Are you looking at that one fish that your competitors are looking at also, or are you looking at opportunities out there in the big blue ocean? So I want to say thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I want to kind of point out on your table is a magazine called Fora. And in the very middle of that magazine are actually 4 of the slides that I used on the sizing of the market and what your corporate counsel are looking for, some of the pressures that they have. So feel free to take this magazine. If you have any questions about the data or interested in any of it, feel free. I'm more than willing to share it. So thank you again for the opportunity. I hope you guys have a great day. Anyone have questions? Yes, ma'am.
I'm just curious, what went wrong, if anything, in October, and what does that mean for the next couple months?
You know, it's a really good question because as soon as I saw that data, I kind of asked my colleagues, you know, what was going on. But it was a very busy summer compared to what you typically see from a production standpoint. And so I think that it was more one of those, you know, we need to kind of regroup and go into the remainder of the year. There wasn't one single item that stuck out that said that's why it was a bad month, because it's not usually been that kind of October. But we had a very, very busy summer. Or they had a very, very busy summer. So it might be that case. And also, in addition to that, you know, some of the data that we have is obviously we need to see billings from our firms because we gather the data directly from their timing billing systems. And so there may have been a lag in that also because we're smack into now the collection push. So it was not one clear thing. It just was a big hiccup that hopefully doesn't fall into November. November data is just coming out now. So yeah, it was unusual. Unusual. Good question, though. Does anyone else have another question? Thank you.